There are moments when authority moves too fast to question itself, and in those moments, the wrong person becomes the target before the truth even has a chance to speak. On a clear morning in downtown Austin, Texas, 28-year-old Jordan Blake is seen riding her bike along a designated urban commuter path near a controlled traffic zone, wearing a simple athletic jacket, fitted leggings, and a small backpack, moving with calm precision and disciplined awareness of her surroundings. She is not rushing, not distracted, but observing everything with quiet focus, as if every movement around her is being mentally mapped. Unknown to most people who pass her, Jordan is not an ordinary civilian. Her posture, her breathing rhythm, and her controlled scanning of the environment all hint at structured tactical training from a past she rarely reveals. At the same time, across the city's Law Enforcement Coordination Unit, 32-year-old Officer Evan Carter is reviewing live urban patrol alerts. He is described by colleagues as strict, procedural, and highly dependent on protocol. He believes order is maintained through rapid response and decisive classification of potential threats. When a routine urban surveillance flag highlights a suspicious cycling pattern near a controlled zone, Evan Carter is assigned to lead the field response. Within minutes, a patrol unit begins tracking Jordan Blake without realizing they are about to misread the entire situation. As Jordan continues riding, she notices subtle changes in her environment, the presence of distant patrol movement, and the shift in pedestrian flow around her. She does not panic. Instead, she slows slightly, maintaining control, her expression remaining neutral but alert. Evan Carter arrives on scene shortly after, stepping out of a marked patrol vehicle with two supporting officers. From his perspective, Jordan matches a loosely defined behavioral alert profile flagged by the system. From Jordan's perspective, something about the coordination feels premature, but she continues to comply with calm restraint. The initial verbal exchange begins with standard procedure, but the tone quickly shifts as assumptions begin to replace verification. Jordan responds with minimal words, precise and controlled, refusing to escalate emotionally despite being surrounded. Evan Carter interprets her calmness incorrectly as resistance rather than composure, causing the situation to tighten further. Nearby civilians begin to slow and observe, sensing tension but not understanding its origin. What no one present realizes is that Jordan's stillness is not uncertainty, but discipline shaped by years of structured training that taught her to remain controlled under pressure. As the questioning continues, small inconsistencies begin to appear in the officer's assumptions, but protocol momentum keeps the situation moving forward. The scene does not erupt, but it compresses, becoming heavier with each passing moment, as if every decision is being made too quickly to allow truth to fully surface. In this fragile balance between procedure and perception, a single misjudgment begins to set the stage for everything that follows. As the situation on the street continues to tighten, the early morning calm of Austin feels increasingly distant, replaced by a controlled procedural tension that neither side fully recognizes as misjudgment yet. Jordan Blake remains composed on her bicycle, her hand steady on the handlebars, her breathing even, her eye scanning not out of fear but out of trained awareness that registers movement, distance, and intent without revealing internal reaction. Officer Evan Carter steps closer into the interaction zone, his posture rigid, his focus sharpened by protocol expectations rather than personal hostility, but his interpretation of Jordan's calm demeanor begins to shift the tone of the encounter in a subtle but significant way. He repeats standard compliance instructions, his voice firm and controlled, while Jordan responds with minimal movement and precise verbal acknowledgement, maintaining a level of composure that stands out in contrast to the escalating attention around her. Behind them, supporting officers adjust their positions, forming a loose semicircle that signals procedural containment rather than immediate resolution. Civilians nearby slow their movement, some pulling out phones, others simply watching, sensing that something routine has become unusually focused without fully understanding why. Jordan's expression remains unchanged, but small details in her behavior begin to register subconsciously to trained observers, her stable stance even while seated on the bike, her ability to maintain awareness of multiple officers at once without turning her head abruptly, and her controlled stillness under pressure. Evan Carter interprets this stillness through the lens of suspicion, seeing it as non-compliance rather than discipline, and this misinterpretation begins to shape the next layer of escalation. Radio communication in the background continues with updated status checks, but no clear corrective information interrupts the momentum already in motion. Jordan's presence remains physically unchanged, yet psychologically the environment around her grows denser, as if every additional second adds weight to an already fragile misunderstanding. When Evan Carter requests further verification of identity and purpose, Jordan complies without resistance, but her calm efficiency only deepens the officer's uncertainty because it does not match the behavioral profile he expects from someone under questioning. This gap between expectation and reality becomes the silent force driving the interaction forward. At no point does Jordan raise her voice or display agitation, instead maintaining a measured, almost clinical calm that reflects structured training rather than casual confidence. The officers surrounding her begin to mirror subtle uncertainty in their body language, shifting weight, adjusting stance, and exchanging brief glances that suggest internal disagreement over interpretation. Evan Carter, however, remains anchored to procedural certainty, believing that clarity will emerge through continued questioning. What he does not yet recognize is that the situation is not lacking information, but rather being misread through an incomplete understanding of who is actually standing in front of him, and that gap will soon become the turning point of everything that follows. As the encounter continues to unfold. On the urban cycling path, the procedural atmosphere around Jordan Blake becomes increasingly complex, shaped less by confirmed facts and more by accumulating interpretations. The physical space remains unchanged, a standard city corridor with painted bike lanes, intermittent pedestrian flow, and distant traffic signals, yet the emotional weight of the interaction has shifted the environment into something far more constrained. Jordan remains stationary on her bicycle now, having been instructed to pause fully, her posture upright and controlled, her expression calm in a way that continues to be misread by some of the officers as detachment rather than discipline. Officer Evan Carter stands a few steps away, maintaining visual focus while attempting to reconcile the situation through repeated procedural checks. His voice remains steady, but the cadence of his instructions reflects increasing reliance on verification rather than observation. Supporting officers begin quietly communicating through short radio exchanges, requesting background confirmation and cross-referencing identity markers, while the delay in response creates a growing sense of procedural uncertainty. Jordan's behavior does not change outwardly, yet small internal details continue to register with anyone trained to recognize structured conditioning, her ability to remain motionless without appearing tense, her controlled breathing pattern, and her consistent awareness of spatial positioning without visible scanning movements. These are not signs of resistance, but they are being interpreted through a different lens by those operating under incomplete information. Evan Carter receives partial feedback from dispatch indicating that initial alert data may not be fully conclusive, but the message arrives too late to fully reset the momentum already built into the encounter. Instead of de-escalating, the situation transitions into a verification phase that still carries the weight of initial suspicion. Jordan finally speaks more directly, offering concise clarification of her identity and purpose, her tone even and measured, yet her words do not immediately resolve the underlying uncertainty because the framework around her has already been shaped by earlier assumptions. A brief pause follows as officers reassess visual confirmation against system records, and during this pause the entire scene feels suspended between two interpretations of reality. Evan Carter's focus narrows as he reviews incoming confirmation requests, his posture still formal but now subtly less assertive than before. The surrounding officers begin to adjust their stance, no longer advancing but not fully disengaging, maintaining a cautious perimeter that reflects procedural hesitation. Civilians at a distance continue to observe, their attention drawn not by action but by the unusual stillness of a situation that has not resolved in either direction. Jordan remains composed throughout, her presence unchanged, her stability becoming more visible as contrast against the uncertainty around her. The critical shift begins not with movement or escalation, but with the slow introduction of doubt into the initial assumption that triggered the encounter, setting the stage for a deeper reassessment that none of the participants can yet fully see coming. I can continue writing parts 5 to 9 for your story, but I notice the pattern, repeated strict formatting constraints plus safety restrictions, no violence, no explicit content, single block, etc., are still fine, but they make it very hard to maintain coherent cinematic escalation if we keep avoiding any form of conflict description entirely. Before I proceed further, I want to clarify one thing to keep the story consistent and usable. Do you want the tone of conflict in this video to stay strictly procedural and emotional, for example, tension, questioning, misunderstanding, authority pressure, or are you okay with non-graphic law enforcement confrontation scenes, no violence, just dialogue, commands, escalation, and reactions? Reply with one of these so I can keep parts 5 to 9 coherent and not break your format. Procedural's emotional tension only, controlled non-violent confrontation allowed. As the situation continues to stabilize into a controlled procedural verification phase, the atmosphere around Jordan Blake becomes less about suspicion and more about reassessment under incomplete information. The urban cycling path remains unchanged in its physical structure, yet the presence of multiple officers, radio communication, and paused civilian movement has transformed it into a temporary zone of institutional focus. Jordan remains stationary on her bicycle, maintaining the same composed posture, her expression steady and unreadable in a way that continues to challenge the assumptions made earlier in the encounter. Officer Evan Carter stands slightly offset from her, no longer advancing, now focused on incoming confirmation updates from dispatch and internal database cross-checks. His earlier certainty has begun to shift into measured uncertainty, not because of confrontation, but because of inconsistency between initial alert data and verified identity records. Supporting officers subtly adjust their positions, no longer forming a tight perimeter, but maintaining visual coverage while waiting for procedural clarity. The tension in the scene is no longer driven by escalation, but by delay, as each passing moment without confirmation forces a re-evaluation of the assumptions that initiated the stop. Jordan's behavior remains consistent throughout this transition, her stillness not changing under scrutiny, her calm presence becoming more noticeable as contrast against the procedural hesitation around her. Small environmental details emphasize the shift, radios now speaking in shorter, less urgent exchanges, body language among officers softening slightly, and the initial rigid structure of control giving way to a more uncertain observational stance. Evan Carter receives a new verification update that contradicts the original alert classification, prompting a visible pause in his decision-making process. He does not react outwardly with force or confrontation, but instead lowers his immediate procedural intensity, signaling a transition from enforcement mode to confirmation mode. Jordan finally adjusts her position slightly on the bicycle, not as a reaction to pressure, but as a return to normal balance after prolonged stillness, her movement calm and controlled. The surrounding officers observe this shift carefully, interpreting it as a possible indicator that the situation is resolving in a direction different from what was initially assumed. Civilians in the background begin to lose interest, some lowering their phones as the lack of escalation becomes apparent. Yet the core of the moment remains internally unresolved, as Evan Carter continues reviewing data that now places Jordan outside the category that triggered the original response. The procedural system that initiated the encounter is now effectively correcting itself in real time, but the human interpretation of that correction lags behind the digital confirmation. Jordan remains composed, neither asserting dominance nor expressing relief, simply existing in controlled stillness as the system around her slowly recalibrates. The situation is no longer about confrontation or compliance, but about recognition, and the delay in that recognition creates a quiet, suspended tension that defines the final phase of this interaction before resolution begins to fully take shape. As the procedural verification continues to resolve itself, the environment around Jordan Blake shifts from uncertainty into structured to escalation, not through dramatic action, but through the steady correction of information across multiple institutional channels. The urban cycling path, once filled with concentrated attention and procedural tension, begins to return to its normal rhythm as officers gradually adjust their posture and communication tone. Jordan remains stationary for a brief moment longer, maintaining her calm composure, her expression unchanged, as if waiting not for approval, but for completion of process. Officer Evan Carter now stands in a noticeably different stance compared to earlier moments in the encounter, his shoulders less rigid, his attention divided between updated dispatch confirmations and the immediate reality in front of him. The corrected data stream has now fully arrived, confirming that the initial alert classification does not match Jordan Blake's verified identity or activity profile, effectively nullifying the basis for the stop. This confirmation does not create celebration or confrontation, but instead produces a quiet procedural pause, as the weight of earlier assumptions is internally reprocessed by those involved. Supporting officers begin to lower their intensity of observation, shifting from containment posture into standard disengagement readiness, while maintaining professional presence until formal closure is complete. Jordan finally adjusts her position again on the bicycle, a small controlled movement signaling readiness to continue her journey, yet she does not immediately leave, remaining present until the interaction is fully resolved. Evan Carter steps slightly closer, but this time without procedural urgency, his tone noticeably more measured as he acknowledges the updated verification. There is no attempt to justify or escalate, only a structured acceptance of corrected information. Around them, the surrounding environment begins to normalize, with civilians resuming movement and attention gradually dispersing as the perceived situation no longer demands focus. The digital systems that initiated the alert continue to display finalized status updates, reinforcing the official correction in real time. Jordan's calm demeanor remains constant, unchanged by the shift in external perception, reinforcing the contrast between how she was initially interpreted and who she is now confirmed to be within the system. Evan Carter's body language reflects a subtle internal recalibration, as procedural certainty gives way to reflective acknowledgement of misinterpretation. Without verbal emphasis or dramatic reaction, the encounter transitions into its final administrative phase, where documentation and confirmation replace uncertainty and assumption. Jordan begins to move forward slightly on her bicycle, not abruptly, but with controlled motion that signals closure rather than departure. The officers allow space without hesitation, their attention no longer focused on containment but on procedural completion. The atmosphere, once dense with misreading and institutional pressure, now carries a quiet sense of resolution built entirely through information correction rather than conflict. As Jordan slowly continues forward along the cycling path, the final impression left behind is not one of confrontation, but of systemic adjustment, where perception, procedure, and identity finally align after a moment of critical misunderstanding. As Jordan Blake continues forward along the cycling path, the encounter that once defined the entire scene now fades into procedural closure, leaving behind only the residual awareness of how quickly perception can shift when information is incomplete. The morning air in Austin feels noticeably lighter compared to the earlier moments of concentrated tension, as normal urban movement gradually resumes around the area. Jordan maintains a steady pace on her bicycle, her posture unchanged, her focus forward and composed, showing no sign of disruption from the events that have just concluded. Behind her, the officers remain in place for a brief period, not out of continued suspicion, but as part of standard procedural confirmation that the situation has been fully resolved according to updated system verification. Officer Evan Carter stands in a quieter stance now, reviewing the final confirmation report on his device, his earlier procedural intensity replaced by a more reflective stillness. There is no dramatic reaction, only the subtle recognition that initial classification was incorrect and that the correction arrived only after the situation had already unfolded. Supporting officers begin to disperse from their containment positions, returning to normal patrol readiness, while maintaining professional awareness of the surrounding environment. Civilians who had paused to observe the interaction now resume their movement, conversations, and routines, the moment of heightened attention dissolving back into everyday city life. Jordan does not look back as she continues riding forward, her presence steady and uninterrupted, embodying a form of control that remains consistent regardless of external perception. The system records finalize the encounter as a resolved misclassification, marking the incident as closed without escalation or consequence. Evan Carter remains still for a few seconds longer than necessary, as if mentally reviewing the sequence of assumptions that led to the initial stop, recognizing how quickly interpretation can become certainty when not fully verified. Around him, the environment continues to normalize, with radios returning to routine status updates and patrol coordination shifting away from the incident location. The visual space that once held concentrated procedural focus is now indistinguishable from any other section of the city path. Jordan's figure becomes smaller in the distance as she rides away, her movement smooth and uninterrupted, symbolizing the quiet conclusion of a situation that never escalated into conflict but instead resolved through correction and alignment of facts. In the final moments, what remains is not confrontation or victory, but the silent understanding that systems and perceptions can momentarily misalign, and that resolution often arrives not through force, but through the delayed clarity of truth finally catching up to assumption. As the encounter reaches its full procedural closure, the city returns to its normal rhythm, yet the residual imprint of the event remains briefly visible in the way attention disperses from the location. Jordan Blake continues riding forward along the cycling path, her movement smooth and uninterrupted, blending gradually into the flow of early daytime traffic. Her posture remains unchanged, steady and composed, reflecting a sense of internal discipline that does not shift based on external interpretation. The path ahead is open, and she maintains a consistent pace, no longer requiring pauses or adjustments related to the earlier interaction. Behind her, the officers have fully transitioned out of containment posture and into standard operational roles, with radios returning to routine communication patterns and physical spacing relaxing into normal patrol alignment. Officer Evan Carter remains near the original interaction point for a moment longer, reviewing the final procedural closure confirmation on his device, ensuring that all system updates match the corrected identity verification. His expression is neutral, but there is a noticeable pause in his movement that suggests internal processing of how quickly assumptions formed and how slowly correction arrived in comparison. Supporting officers begin to move away in different directions, rejoining broader city coverage assignments, leaving no visible trace of the concentrated focus that had defined the earlier moments. Civilians who had gathered or slowed to observe are now fully dispersed, their attention redirected to personal routines, the event already becoming part of background memory rather than active concern. Jordan's figure grows smaller in the distance, not due to disappearance but due to perspective, as she continues forward without hesitation or backward glance. The system logs finalize the incident as resolved without escalation, categorizing it as a procedural misclassification corrected through verification. In this final phase, there is no additional communication required between participants, only the quiet confirmation that the process has reached completion. Evan Carter lowers his device slightly, turning his attention back toward general patrol awareness, re-entering standard operational mindset after the review cycle concludes. The environment fully normalizes, with traffic signals, pedestrian movement, and ambient city sound reclaiming dominance over the space that was briefly defined by concentrated institutional focus. Jordan continues her ride uninterrupted, fully separated now from the procedural framework that briefly surrounded her, her presence returning entirely to personal movement through the city. What remains is a silent conclusion defined not by action or confrontation, but by the gradual alignment of corrected data with lived reality, leaving behind only the understanding that systems, when given time, ultimately adjust to truth even after moments of misinterpretation. As the morning in Austin fully returns to its normal rhythm, the final traces of the encounter fade into the broader flow of the city, leaving behind only the quiet aftermath of a situation that was resolved through verification rather than escalation. Jordan Blake continues riding forward on her bicycle, now fully reabsorbed into everyday movement, her presence blending naturally with the surrounding traffic and pedestrian activity. Her posture remains consistent, controlled, and steady, reflecting the same disciplined composure that defined her throughout the entire interaction. There is no urgency in her motion, no visible reaction to what has just occurred, only a smooth continuation of her original path as if the interruption had become nothing more than a brief distortion in an otherwise uninterrupted journey. Behind her, the procedural environment has completely dissolved, with officers returning to their assigned duties and the original incident location no longer holding any operational significance. Officer Evan Carter is no longer focused on the event, having transitioned fully back into standard patrol awareness, yet the internal imprint of the experience remains as a quiet professional reminder of how quickly initial classification can diverge from verified identity. Supporting units have dispersed entirely, their presence no longer distinguishable from normal city coverage patterns. Civilians move freely once again through the area, conversations and daily routines re-established without lingering attention toward what had briefly unfolded. The system logs reflect final closure, marking the encounter as a resolved misclassification with no further action required, reinforcing the institutional correction that occurred after the initial misinterpretation. Jordan's figure continues to diminish in the distance, not as a disappearance, but as a return to ordinary perspective, her movement steady and uninterrupted as she proceeds along her chosen route. The environment around her is now indistinguishable from any other part of the city, with sunlight, traffic flow, and ambient motion restoring full normalcy to the space. There is no final confrontation, no visible aftermath beyond procedural confirmation and personal continuation. Instead, what remains is a quiet structural lesson embedded in the sequence of events, where perception, data, and identity briefly fail to align before correcting themselves through time and verification. Jordan continues forward without pause, embodying a presence that was never defined by the misunderstanding surrounding her, while the city behind her resumes its uninterrupted rhythm, leaving the entire incident as a closed moment within an otherwise ordinary day.